I'd like now to introduce our first speaker for the afternoon sessions, Dr. Jessica Harris. She is first and foremost a culinary historian, but before she landed in the realm of food, she was a journalist, a book review editor at Essence, and a theater critic for New York Amsterdam News, the country's oldest black newspaper. Harris, a former professor of English at Queens College, City University of New York, has received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Southern Foodways Alliance and is a James Beard Foundation Special Award honoree. Her primary food interests are the culinary history and foodways of the African diaspora. The author of several books, she has recently published her memoir, My Soul Looks Back. While born in Queens and living still in New York, Dr. Harris also has a home in New Orleans and is no stranger to the historic New Orleans collection. Please help me in welcoming back Dr. Jessica Harris.
Good afternoon. I am the one who has been selected to provide your post-luncheon levity. First, a little bit about what a food historian does. We are a new breed, and what we do is use we dance on everybody else's playing field is pretty much what we do. We have some cases methodology that is that of historians. We equally may have methodology that is that of anthropologists. Sometimes we are sociologists, and sometimes we are social activists. So we can be all over the map. In this one, I'm trying to take a more historic tact, but some of the other stuff may just creep in, so please, indulgence. I also should probably note that I got off the plane at 11:30, so if all of a sudden I do a dive toward the computer, you'll understand the problem, I hope. Many years ago, on television, was a Saturday morning cartoon. It was a show called Schoolhouse Rock. They taught grammar and eventually civics and mathematics. Somehow, that show recently came back to me. In teaching math, they had a song called 3 is a Magic Number. Indeed, yet somebody remembers it. Indeed, 3 is a magic number. It is a number that the Yoruba of southwestern Nigeria attribute to the trickster Orisha Elegba or Elegwa, the owner of the crossroads who is occasionally syncretized with the Christian devil for his wicked ways of deceiving the unsuspecting. Needless to say, it is an important number in the Christian church. Even in matters culinary, there are numerous references made to varying holy trinities of seasonings and spices. 3 is certainly a magic number when referring to the city of New Orleans. The city has its own Native American history. The French, the Spanish, and later English-speaking Americans would represent European cultures. Wolof, Diola, Fon, Yoruba, and more represent the African continent. The longer that I thought about these things, the more I realized that 3 was indeed the magic number, not only in religious and secular matters, but also in the foodways of the city. I hope that's not mine, but it might be. The early foodways and their subsequent evolutions are the result of an intricate braiding of 3 continents' cultures: American, European, African. All have made a place at the table that is New Orleans. Although I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the French, they were the last to arrive in what would become the United States, having spent their time battling the British and establishing colonies in the Caribbean and Canada. They arrived with different attitudes toward race and enslavement from the Spanish, and often brought their children of liaisons with Africans who had been enslaved in the Caribbean with them to the mainland. The French were trappers, traders more than settlers, and their society was initially one with few women. Therefore, liaisons with Native American women were common. Because of their Indian wives, they lived in closer proximity to the native peoples and learned much about their ways. They were also inveterate chroniclers of things culinary, and that's one of the fun things about being a culinary historian. You're not just reading cookbooks. Occasionally you're reading travel recites and journals and explorers' memoirs and so on and so forth. And the French were wonderful at that and left some of the best observations of Native American lives. So while I will speak of the French contributions later, I will begin with their observations of First Peoples, Native peoples. As we have oral history versus written history, and specifically the written history tends to be from the French to describe Native American foodways of the early period. They had a rich field for observation, as was witnessed by the explorer Lapage du Prats, who recorded the annual calendar of the Natchez people of the lower Mississippi in 1758. And I quote, "The nation begins its year in the month of March, as was the practice for a long time in Europe, and divides it into 13 months. At every new moon, they celebrate a feast, which takes its name from the principal fruits gathered in the preceding moon, or from the animals they hunted then. The first moon is that of the deer. The renewal of the year spreads universal joy. The second moon, which corresponds to our month of April, is that of strawberries. The third moon was little corn, the fourth, watermelons, either the current ones or these peculiar ones that were shown in early journals. The fifth, peaches, the sixth, mulberries, the seventh, great corn, the eighth, turkeys, the ninth, bison, 10th, bears, 11th, cold meal, probably cold cornmeal porridge of some sort, and 12th, chestnuts. The 13th month was also nuts, but those nuts were broken and then mixed with cornmeal to make bread in the cold months when famine was always a possibility. As reported by the French explorers, the year unfolded in an ever-ending, ever-changing celebration of foodstuffs. The months are shifted somewhat by other travelers to the lower Mississippi, but the regions and the food available and the game were the organizing principles of most of the tribes, and each month began with a feast. In times of plenty, feasts were lavish. In times of want, there was less. But there was always an acknowledgement of the changing foodstuffs. So all of this stuff that we're doing now about eat seasonally, eat locally, all of that way back and deeply embedded in Native American culture. The feasts that started each cycle were harvest celebrations of the first fruits, designed to ensure continuing supplies of food and bring health and prosperity. When there was abundance, a repertoire of recipes was available. There were pumpkin preparations and multiple uses for corn. There were also stews thickened with pounded sassafras leaves, an addition that's still used as filet in some of Louisiana's gumbos. Early explorers even mention a dish of chestnuts and corn that was pounded, kneaded, and wrapped in green corn blades and boiled. Note to all, think about that. That may be the first indication of tamales in the Delta. There are numerous items that the native peoples contributed to the New Orleans table. As corn and other things may be better known, I want to really just briefly talk about two. The first is sassafras. The tree, okay, and here we have, again, an old representation of the sassafras, and these old images, for the most part, are from the collection, so please note the richness and the depth of the collection. The leaves are pounded. Any of you who had the opportunity to visit the New Orleans Crescent City Farmers Market maybe a decade ago were perhaps able to see a gentleman named Lionel Keyes. This is Lionel Keyes' Uncle Bill's mortar. Lionel was an expert. He sold filet in little teeny tiny baby food jars. And the baby food jars were, obviously sterilized. But he was very, very particular about how he made his filet. And he didn't tell anybody. The greatest secrets. So what we knew was that the leaves were pounded into a fine powder. But what he didn't tell us was when they were picked. And he had to pick them at a certain season. He had to know when to collect them. He had to know when to dry them. He had to know all of these things. And this is all part of that oral history that is so wonderful. When they're finally done, obviously, filet is what is the result. And filet was given a name for the thing that the powder does when it's added to a hot liquid. It produces threads. A thread in French is a fil. Télégraphie sans fil, TSF, used to be what they called a telephone, a wireless telegraph. But the verb is filet, as in to thread. So filet becomes filet, as in our filet gumbo. There are also pecans. The nut is a species of hickory that is native to Mexico and the southern United States. They were first seen by Spanish explorers in the 16th century. The name, pecan, sometimes called pecans in other parts of the country, is a term which was used for any nut that had to be cracked with a stone. The buttery flavor was remarked on early and taken to the hearts and stomachs of all. We move on to the Europeans. Europe, point one, the French, if you will. Early on, the settlers discovered that the staple of their diet in Europe, wheat, would not grow in the swampy, humid land. Wheat was shipped from Europe, but in the early years, European settlers went as much as 2 years without a shipment. So, that would make you kind of testy. The result was that they had to learn from native peoples, and they learned to cultivate corn and made a variety of breads from the corn. They also learned to eat a variety of squashes like chayote, called here and nowhere else in the world, mirliton. Okay, it's called chocho in Jamaica, chouchou in Brazil, but here it is simply mirliton. And kashaw. Think about that kashaw, because there were kashaw pies, there were kashaw porridges, there were all sorts of various things that people learned how to make with these native vegetables. They created stews that they sweetened with syrup made from berries, and they used that aforementioned sassafras to thicken their stews. It's a thickener. Those threads thicken the broth. They also learned to eat what was available. You get the general idea. The French settlers, though, were not happy with this diet, and the Compagnie des Indes began a campaign to recruit farming immigrants to the area. They especially pinpointed German and Swiss prospects who arrived and settled outside of the city by 1721 in the area known today as the Côte des Allemands, the German coast. There they set about farming and producing fresh produce and foodstuffs that contributed to the fledgling city's growth. They also brought a knowledge of baking and managed to cultivate wheat so that they could do that. They also brought a knowledge of sausage making. The first explains some of those Cajun gumbos with the sausage andouille and things of that sort. The second explains why some of the old city bakeries have German or German-sounding names. The next contributors were the Ursuline nuns, the first group of whom arrived August 6, 1727, to become the city's indispensable doyenne and culture bearers. The nuns were the daughters of aristocrats and the upper middle classes, and they brought with them more formal notions of French cuisine. They also brought a knowledge of herbs and an entire pharmacopoeia. They planted the first herb garden in the colony. and used bay leaves, not only in soups and stews, but as well as in the flour. They used it to keep the weevils out of the flour. They used dill. It encouraged sleep, as well as seasoned stews, and they used shallots for strength. They understood that parsley would attenuate the harshness of garlic, and they were also instrumental in the creation of the city's holy trinity: celery, bell pepper, onion. They took the French classics and adapted them to local ingredients, and in an increasing way, hybrid variations of cooking developed. It was no longer purely French, it was becoming something new. As the French presence grew, so did the number of Africans and their descendants. For if the native peoples had been here and were aware of the terrain and its offerings, and the French were often dependent on them for their survival, the Africans were brought in chains to work. This, though, did not mean that they came without the knowledge or skills. They took what they had and had a major hand in the creation of the city's cuisine. If you take a look at this, it begins to tell us something about what we're discussing here. If you look at those slave trade routes, and you think about those slave trade routes, if I had the technical skill to embed a video, I would have embedded a video in here. It is online. For those of you who are interested in the slave trade, there is something called the transatlantic slave trade in 1 minute. It is a staggering picturing of the slave routes as they went and of the number of ships that crossed the Atlantic. According to historian Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, some of the early enslaved in New Orleans came from Senegambia. If you look at Senegal, we see that it is the westernmost point on the African continent. It's called Senegambia formally because the Gambia, in a wonderful testimonial to the vagaries of colonialism, is a country on either sides of the banks of the Gambia River. So it is totally surrounded on 3 sides by Senegal. The tourist office tried to make a big deal out of that at some point and called the Gambia the smile on the face of Senegal. So you get another idea of that. But Senegal was one of the countries that early sent enslaved Africans to this hemisphere. Let's consider some points. Consider that from 1668 to 1829, of the 145,000 enslaved shipped out of the port of Saint Louis de Senegal, and Saint Louis de Senegal would be the northernmost point in that country. 41,000 went to Saint-Domingue. In the continental United States, 10,000 went to Charleston, and 5,700 to the Gulf Coast, probably entering through New Orleans or Mobile. Southern Senegal is one of the primary rice-growing areas of Western Africa. West Africa, in case you don't know, has its own rice, a native rice that is native to West Africa. Some of you have read the article in the New York Times a few weeks ago, maybe, about the discovery of a new form of rice that may hark back to the African continent in Tobago. It is a non-flood rice, which is extraordinary. So that there was a rice, there was a traditional rice on the African continent. And the enslaved Africans from the regions of southern Senegal, so that would be the Senegal that is below the Gambia, they're known as Diola, and they brought with them their knowledge of rice growing to build the rice industries both in South Carolina and in southern Louisiana. The country's national dish, rice harvest. Unfortunately, South Carolina, not Louisiana. The country's national dish is cebujen. Cebugen is a red rice dish cooked with fish and vegetables, carrots, eggplants, and more, that is reddened with tomato sauce. Some suggest that pre-Columbian exchange, and food historians are always bandying about the term Columbian exchange, but I will explain it a little bit. Before 1492, the food crucibles were not necessarily in flux and in movement in the same way that they were post-1492. Potatoes, tomatoes, corn, New World. Pigs, horses, wheat, Old World, and chilies, New World. So you begin to see what happens, and it happens relatively rapidly given how movement took place in those times. We get chilies moving not just to the African continent, but to Thailand, to India, to the Far East. We get potatoes moving into Europe, although they weren't taken to heart and stomach early on. They were thought to be poisonous. Those pomodoro, those golden apples, were actually tomatoes, yellow ones. And we see all of that moving, but imagine, if you will, the pre-Columbian exchange diet. No tomatoes in Italian food, no potatoes in the food of Germany or the food of Ireland, and no chilies in Thailand. So you get a totally different sense of what that food was. But some suggest that this cebugen that was made red today with tomato paste was perhaps not that way originally. They suggest that it was originally probably reddened or maybe made orange with dende oil or red palm oil, which is native to the African continent and which produces a color that is very similar to the color that's produced by the tomato paste. Others opine that cebugen is simply a creolized dish that originated post-Columbian exchange. Whatever its origin, it's a dish that has been taken to the hearts and stomachs of much of West Africa. There is also cebuganar, the same dish, but substituting chicken for the fish. Cebuganar is also a dish that has traveled. It has moved in Ghana and in Nigeria, and there it is known as jollof rice. Jollof rice in honor of the Jollof Empire of the Wolofs of Senegal. The Jollof Empire existed from 1350 to 1549. Things in movement, and we're going to get back to the cebuganar and the jollof rice shortly, but let's move on. Africa Point 2. Benin. The other nation that Dr. Midlo Hall suggests was a crucible for many of the early enslaved in the city of New Orleans was Benin. It's a north-south narrow strip of land in West Africa. You can see that it lies between the equator and the Tropic of Cancer and is bordered by Togo on the west, Burkina Faso and Niger in the north, Nigeria to the east, and the Bight of Benin to the south. It is one of the smaller countries in West Africa. Officially known as the République du Bénin, it was formerly known, and probably better known to many of us, as Dahomey, or Danhomey, the country in the belly of Dan. Dan is the cosmic snake. It's a small country with a rich history. From the 17th to the 19th century, the main political forces in the region were the Kingdom of Dahomey, the city-state of Porto Novo, which was a tributary to the powerful Kingdom of Oyo. Oyo is located today in Nigeria, and a large area in the north with many different tribes. The southern part of this region was referred to as the Slave Coast from as early as the 17th century, due to the large number of enslaved who were shipped to the New World during the transatlantic slave trade. At its height, the trade, which began with an agreement with the Portuguese in 1472, was sending captured souls to the New World at the astonishing rate of 102,000 per decade. The trade began early and lasted long. Between 1727 and 1863, 582,000 were shipped out of the Dahomean port of Ouida. Of them, 175,000 went to Hispaniola. For that, read Haiti. 43,000 to Martinique, 11,000 to Guadeloupe. Others went to Brazilian ports, and the smallest number, although important for our considerations today, 2,600 to America's Gulf Coast. The low number is misleading, as we'll understand later. One of the key dishes prepared in the area is called sauce feuille, in French, leaf sauce, and is similar to a dish known as efo in Yoruba. It is a thick, soupy stew of leafy greens seasoned with smoked meat or fish. They were also a nation of fritter lovers. And so if you think about fritters, you can think about a white bean fritter that was simply called an akara. It crosses the Atlantic and is transformed, and you can trace a curve of akara across the Atlantic, most immediately to Salvador de Bahia in Brazil, where it becomes the acarajé. If you've been to, somebody's been to Bahia or been to Brazil, it is the classic street food of Brazil. Acarajé is simply an elision of the Yoruba terms akara ije and akara, to eat. In Brazil, however, it is not made with white beans, but rather with a feijão fradinho, which would be similar to an American lady pea, almost like a black-eyed pea. Nowadays, they pretty much just use black-eyed peas. That fritter translates itself. The name stays, the ingredient changes. They become codfish fritters throughout the Caribbean, called acara or acra de morue in places in the French-speaking Caribbean, codfish cakes or other things in the English-speaking Caribbean, and go back to being a bean fritter. A recipe found, interestingly enough, in the cookbook of Mikvah Israel, the oldest synagogue, I believe, in continuous use. There's a whole lot of, sort of things that come in those parentheses when you start talking about synagogues in the hemisphere. But Mikvah Israel has been in continuous use since virtually time immemorial. So what happens is there, the akara is a recipe. It is a bean fritter. But it takes the name of another West African fritter that was a rice fritter. And it is there called a kala. Okay, you're beginning to get what I'm talking about. You're beginning to understand. The light bulbs are going off. That's what food history is about. You read all of this stuff and you try to put it together. Well, that kala clearly moves up into New Orleans. And in Gumbo Yaya, when you read about the kala that were sold on the street, there is just a little side parenthesis where they say, and we were told that there used to be bean kala as well. So you've got that fritter moving all the way up, over, and around. We find that akara kala has taken over the Atlantic world in many guises. The Spaniards. The Roman Catholic Spaniards were in fact the first European nation to settle the American mainland. And Spain fascinates me. I am absolutely in awe of all of the connections. Although European, they had a lengthy connection to and a resulting hybrid culture from an over 700-year occupation by Africans, by the Moors. Now, we get a whole lot of, movement and people who don't want to deal with where the Moors really came from. But if you look at Saudi Arabia, and you look at those arrows, and I didn't make this map, okay, from the Arabian Peninsula into that crucible, the Almoravid and the Almohad dynasty started really in that crucible between lower Algeria, Mauritania, and Niger, right in there, and moves up. The Moors are acknowledged as having had 700 years on the Iberian Peninsula. If you go back and think of Charles Martel, 732, Poitiers, that was as far up into Europe as the Moors got with their incursions. There is this Spanish thing called the Reconquista, the reconquering of the Iberian Peninsula, and it ends in 1492. Great year, easy to remember. Okay, we all hear about Queen Isabella having to hawk her jewels because in 1492 she was at war. She had to get money, she had to raise money to finance Columbus. Okay, she was at war putting the Moors out. On the southern coast, just outside of Gibraltar, a little bit, there is a rock that's called the Suspiro del Moro. And the Suspiro del Moro is a place where allegedly Boabdil, the last caliph of Granada, looked back over his shoulder at the glory that had been Moorish Spain. Well, he had a mama, and his mama did to him what some mamas do to people. And she looked at him and she said, Boabdil, according to legend, why do you sigh like a woman for that which you could not defend like a man? There you go. So, we have the Moorish occupation of Spain. We certainly have the slave trade. But what I only recently learned was that in the post-Reconquista period, there was a vibrant society of Africans on the Iberian Peninsula. There's a town in Portugal called Lagos. There are underpinnings of traditional flamenco, rhythmically connected more to Africa than to Europe or than to the Rom. So they're just beginning to do research on this period in Spain. But the result is a culture that had what I call a triple African whammy. The Spaniards, if you look at their holdings across the Atlantic, their holdings as a result of the Treaty de Tordesillas were vast. The Spaniards were also inveterate rice eaters. Okay, whether that was inherited from the Moors or inherited from Africa or the Middle East. And one of their totemic dishes is paella valenciana, sometimes simply called Spanish rice. All that awful stuff they used to serve you in the school cafeteria that was just red. That's what it was trying to be, paella. Okay. Rice and beans prevail as a culinary paradigm in all of the Hispanic world, with dishes like congri. And I remember sitting down with Mrs. Chase. I don't have to say who she is here because I'm in New Orleans. But Mrs. Chase said that where she was, out in Madisonville, they ate congri and called it congri. But you also get moros y cristianos, the Christians and the Moors, a New World dish whose name tells the story of the history of Spain, the Moors and the Christians, black beans and white rice. If we look at this map, we can see how things traveled. We can see the location of New Orleans, Hispaniola, and Cuba. And if we think about the history of Cuba, I will remind you of one thing. A friend of mine, who is a Cuban culinary historian, Maricel Presilla, once said, Jessica, we think of Cuba and we think of black bean soup. But in Oriente, in the eastern province of Cuba, they don't eat black beans. Cuba actually has a line of bean demarcation. In Oriente, they eat red beans. And they eat red beans as they do in Jamaica, as they do in Haiti, and as they do in New Orleans. So as we start to look at those next arrivals, those people who are connected from the Caribbean, who come up when the world is starting to pulse with all of that stuff, for want of a better term, that would lead to the Haitian Revolution, they're coming into New Orleans from Saint-Domingue. They're coming into New Orleans from Cuba. And they're coming into New Orleans with a dish that is known today and can be found today in Haitian cookbooks as riz national, red beans and rice. They're also coming from Saint-Domingue with their knowledge and experience of sugarcane. And that's an early sugar factory. I think that's the only early slide that was not in the collection that I own. So the collection may get it. But what happened was those who arrived had been enslaved, in many cases in Saint-Domingue, because people came and brought their enslaved people too, if they could, or had knowledge of how to work cane. And they worked sugar. This is a postcard that I own, and I always thought this postcard was somewhere in the Caribbean. And then one day I looked and turned it over, and it was actually harvesting cane outside of New Orleans. So it looks exactly like the Caribbean. The wealth of sugar accumulated in the barrels that lined the town's wharfs. And the rum that was a byproduct of the processing was simply another contribution to the tables of New Orleans and southern Louisiana. In conclusion, the culinary cultures of 3 continents and more have made a home at the tables of New Orleans and southern Louisiana, so that the next time you sit down to a dish of Ponchatoula strawberries, think of the Native Americans. Think of them also. Think of them also when you sprinkle some filet on your gumbo. When you enjoy a dish of jambalaya, think back to Senegal's cebu ganar and to the jollof rice that are certainly its culinary cousins. If you head to Dookie Chase's in the next few weeks to savor Mrs. Chase's gumbo zerbe, take time to recognize its link with sosfeuille of Benin and efo of Nigeria. Remember that pecan in your praline, not that pecan in your praline, or your pecan pie is a truly American nut, and that Monday's red beans and rice link us not only to Haiti, but also to Cuba and to the Hispanic world. Even when you sit down with a simple glass of rum or a mojito, like the one I'm going to have shortly, remember those enslaved Africans of Saint-Domingue and their labor and ingenuity. Please remember the trinity of cultures, Native American, European, and African, that fixed the cuisine. Remember all of the hands that went into the early pots, but also remember those subsequent hands, Italians, Isleños, Vietnamese, Croatians, and more, that have gone into the pots, refining the cuisine into a culinary mosaic that is New Orleans cuisine today. All of them have made New Orleans home, especially at the table. Thank you.